Thank you very much. Good afternoon, regulators, affiliate members, and all persons attending the Aero 2021 Spring Virtual Conference. Welcome. Very pleased to have you here today. Before we begin the general session, Appraisal Regulation Under a Microscope, I want to thank our sponsors. Our platinum sponsor, REVA. Gold sponsors are American Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers, Appraisal Institute, Clear Capital, National Association of Realtors, or NAR, Service One, Service Link, and Solidify. Let's give the sponsors a great big virtual hand. Just some housekeeping. We will hold the questions to the end of this general session. You will have the opportunity to set questions or comments in the chat box. I'll try to monitor that at the end and get to everyone's question or comment. And also, you have the ability to raise your hand, and I will try to call on you. When I do call on you, you'll just unmute yourself and ask your question or make your comment. I am truly pleased and honored to be the moderator for the Appraisal Regulation Under a Microscope general session for Aero. We have the privilege of hearing from three very qualified professionals. Scott DiBiasio, Manager of State and Industry Affairs for the Appraisal Institute. Peter Fontana, member of the Aero Board of Directors, Chair of the Montana Board of Real Estate Appraisers, and a trustee serving on the Appraisal Foundation's Board of Trustees, and Craig Steinle, the 2018 president of Aero, an independent fee appraiser from South Dakota, and the 2021 vice president of the Appraisal Institute. Thank you all. These individuals have the ability and expertise to provide well-timed, critical, and thought-provoking information that will cover the following: proposals already put forth in Congress, state legislatures, and regulatory agencies to focus attention on and call for diversity, equity, and inclusion of people of color and our veterans. Reasonable, proactive steps that can be taken by state appraiser regulatory agencies, as well as actions by the professional appraiser organizations to educate their members and the public. Deliberate initiatives underway that are intended to attract new appraisers' entry into the profession, and the important role that the state appraiser regulators have in their efforts to make the profession more diverse, equitable, and inclusive, including the breakdown of barriers to entry into the appraiser profession, including but not limited to the adoption of PREA. Now let's get started. Take it away, Scott.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Sherry, for that excellent opening introduction to this session on what is a very sensitive and very important topic. I wanted to say thank you to Aero for inviting me to be part of this panel. And this, I think, is the most challenging, but again, yet important issue to face this profession and you all as state regulators. I wanted to preface my comments by saying that, I agree with Dave Button in what he said on Monday, when he said that all we have on this topic of appraiser bias and diversity, equity, and inclusion is a dossier of a few, but growing, number of very disturbing media stories that allege that appraisers have engaged in some type of discriminatory conduct. If those appraisers have done what they are alleged to have done, they have no place in this profession. However, all it takes is one story on ABC News in San Francisco, which happens to be where Speaker Pelosi is from. And there have been a series of reports on ABC7 in San Francisco regarding reports of appraisers undervaluing properties in the Bay Area as well as in Los Angeles. And there have been a series of articles in the New York Times that, of course, is the paper that Chuck Schumer, the majority leader in the Senate, probably reads on a daily basis. And all it takes really is just one of these stories to cause policymakers at all levels of government federal, state, and even local, causes them to react and to examine these issues and to put forth what they think are reasonable solutions. The difficult thing here for appraisers is that, unfortunately, no amount of counterintelligence or data or research or argument is going to be successful in making this issue go away quietly. This is an issue that's going to be with us for a long time, and everyone involved in the real estate finance ecosystem needs to acknowledge that valuation bias, whether it be explicit, implicit, or systemic, is real, and we have to deal with it in as reasonable a manner as possible. I can tell you that policymakers at all levels of government are already acting. My role on this panel is to take the next 10 minutes or so to review some of the legislative and regulatory activity related to this topic, as well as related to appraiser diversity, equity, and inclusion. I will have some suggestions for state appraiser regulators as to things that should be considered and some areas that regulators may want to avoid. And let me share my screen here. So I want to step back to what I think is the watershed moment in this whole discussion. Back on June 20th of 2019, the U.S. House Financial Services Committee, Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance, held a hearing that was entitled, "What's Your Home Worth? A Review of the Appraisal Industry." The hearing was intended to be a holistic look at the appraisal process and appraisal regulation in the 30 years since the enactment of FIRREA. It was intended to look at ways to modernize and improve the appraisal process. However, this hearing very quickly devolved into a conversation almost exclusively focused about the devaluation of real estate assets in Black neighborhoods and the research conducted by one of the witnesses on the panel, the gentleman you see here with his hand raised, Dr. Andre Perry. I'm sure most of you are aware of the very pointed exchange that took place between Representative Al Green from Texas and the panelists. I have to say that I've sat through a lot of legislative hearings, oversight, and informational hearings. And this one probably was the most difficult and uncomfortable to have to sit through. And I was just sitting in the audience. I can't imagine what it was like to have been one of the panelists. I don't know if we followed up yet with Congressman Green to see if in fact he did as he said he was going to do, and has hung this picture in his office with the caption, "Ask me about this picture." I'm fairly certain that he did. And since that time, since June of 2019, Congress has held a few other hearings in which valuation bias has been a topic of discussion. Recordings of all these hearings are available online if you'd like to listen to them. And Congress has not been the only place where oversight and information gathering hearings have been held. Back in March of this year, the California Assembly's Committees on Housing and Community Development, as well as the Banking and Finance Committee, held a joint hearing to address racial disparities in housing. Not surprisingly, the valuation of Black housing assets in both the Bay Area and LA quickly became the focus of the discussion. And as you can see in these quotes, the chairman of the Housing and Community Development Committee pledged to take action to diversify the appraisal profession and institute mandatory bias training. And action has been taken in California. We'll more on that in just a second. Local governments have gotten in on the action too. In Franklin County, Ohio, and most recently in the city of Philadelphia, where the city council recently held a hearing on racial bias in residential real estate appraisals. I wanted to touch very quickly on some of the pre-existing state bias and anti-discrimination related regulatory requirements for appraisers. Since at least 2008, Ohio has had a requirement in place for appraisers to take a course related to federal, state, and municipal fair housing laws as part of their qualifying education. And since 2010, New York has required that aspiring certified general real estate appraisers complete a 15-hour course on fair housing, fair lending, and environmental issues as part of their qualifying education. Interestingly enough, this course in New York is not required of appraiser assistants or licensed appraisers, and it is an elective for certified residential. So what have we seen in terms of federal and state proposals over the last year or so? Of course, at the federal level, the House Financial Services Committee recently reported out HR 2553, the Real Estate Valuation Fairness and Improvement Act of 2021. Several of the previous speakers have talked about some of the specifics of this legislation, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but it will form a task force to look at barriers to entry in the profession that are disproportionately preventing minorities from becoming appraisers. It would authorize the appropriation of up to $250 million over a 5-year period to promote diversity and inclusion in the appraisal profession through the funding of scholarships at historically Black colleges and universities, and by helping minorities to fulfill the experience requirements to become an appraiser. A portion of the $250 million would also be used to provide implicit bias training for appraisers. Action on the topics of appraiser diversity, equity, and inclusion has also been brisk in the state capitals. California is currently considering Assembly Bill 948, the Fair Appraisal Act. This bill would require that all sales contracts contain a statement that all appraisals of the property are required to be unbiased and not influenced by improper or illegal consideration. The bill would also require California's BREA to change their complaint form to collect demographic data when someone is filing a complaint against an appraiser, especially in cases where the complaint is alleging that the appraiser engaged in biased or discriminatory activity. Also required of the appraiser pre-licensing education in California would be 1 hour of instruction in cultural competencies, which I believe to be like sensitivity training for appraisers. Existing appraisers would be required to take 3 hours of continuing education during each 4-year cycle on the elimination of bias and also on those cultural competencies. The Appraisal Institute is strongly supportive of this bill. We think that this is the least that the profession can do to ensure that all appraisers have at least some exposure to how valuation bias can become part of the appraiser's work, even if it is on an unintentional and unconscious basis. And if the profession does not support this legislation, something else will almost certainly be proposed without our input and may be much less reasonable than what is contained in AB 948. The Illinois Senate is currently considering 2 bills that have already been passed by the House that have appraiser bias and discrimination related components. In Minnesota, we have Senate File 1020, which is currently awaiting the governor's signature. This bill has a component requiring appraisers to complete CE on valuation bias. New Jersey has a bill that would prohibit appraisers and AMCs from discriminating in the valuation of residential property on the basis of all of the protected classes. And lastly, New York recently finalized action on an administrative rule that beginning on January 1st of 2022 will require state licensed and state certified appraisers to complete 4 hours of CE on the subject of fair housing and fair lending during each 2-year licensing cycle. The one concern that I do have with the New York regulation is that it has a very, very heavy emphasis on fair housing and fair lending as implied by the title. I'm not sure that this course is going to be helpful to certified general appraisers. We heard on Monday from Wayne Miller, who laid out several very good examples of commercial appraisal scenarios where implicit appraiser bias could become a concern. But the regulations in place now, we'll just have to deal with it as best we can. Now, I thought it would be good to offer some suggestions to state appraisal regulators as to proactive steps that can be taken to help appraisers become more aware of the concepts of implicit, explicit, and structural bias. States should consider adopting laws and regulations which require appraisers to take both qualifying education and continuing education on valuation bias and discrimination. Fair housing and equal opportunity can be included in this requirement. However, valuation bias is a much broader topic than just fair housing. For currently licensed appraisers, this course could either be a one-time or a periodic requirement of an appropriate length. I think the sweet spot probably is somewhere around 5 hours. And that could be a requirement that they take that course every 5 years or every 3 licensing cycles or something of the like. Existing federal and state anti-discrimination laws subject appraisers and lenders that have engaged in discriminatory activities as part of the real estate lending process to significant civil and/or criminal penalties. We heard on Monday from the CFPB regarding their enforcement of ECOA. HUD also has its Office of Fair Housing, and many states have fair housing and civil rights agencies that have expertise investigating these types of matters. States should consider doing like Illinois is doing and adopt reasonable additional laws and regulations that clarify that a state appraiser regulatory agency has the responsibility to suspend or revoke the license of any appraiser that has been found via a fully adjudicated administrative or judicial proceeding to have committed one or more civil or criminal violations of federal and state anti-discrimination laws. However, state appraiser licensing agencies should not be given the responsibility to investigate and prosecute claims of bias and discrimination against appraisers, except as they relate specifically to USPAP. These investigations and prosecutions should be left to the agencies and officials that have been statutorily given this responsibility and that have expertise to investigate and prosecute these matters equitably, efficiently, and effectively. And last, but certainly not least, I think that PAREA has a very strong role to play in making the appraisal profession look more demographically like America. However, state regulatory uptake of PAREA since the beginning of the year has been slow. Without having knowledge of what portion of the experience hour requirements a state is going to permit PAREA to be utilized for, makes it very difficult for a potential PAREA provider, that's a mouthful, to decide whether to invest the necessary capital. Clearly, state approval and the amount of credit that an aspiring appraiser is going to get is going to have a lot to do with whether that appraiser is willing to spend the money necessary to complete a PAREA program. I think it's unlikely that a trainee will engage in a PAREA program unless they know for sure that that completion of that program will satisfy 100% of the experience hour requirement for having done so. So far, only 3 states that I'm aware of, Colorado, Iowa, and Montana, have said that they will accept PAREA to satisfy 100% of the experience hour requirements to become either a licensed residential or certified residential appraiser. Ohio is said to be coming out with a rulemaking very shortly that would do something very similar. And I think one of the Ohio board members is going to talk a little bit about that during the next session. California has said that they will allow an appraiser to utilize PAREA to satisfy 50% of the experience hour requirements for LR and CR. And astonishingly, Pennsylvania has said that PAREA can be used to satisfy only 25% of the experience hour requirements for LR and CR, and only 15% of the experience hour requirement for certified general. In addition, there are 14 other states that have fully incorporated the real property appraiser qualification criteria by reference into their statutes and regulations. It is my opinion that in those states, PAREA is already accepted to satisfy 100% of the experience hour requirements by virtue of PAREA being part of the criteria. Lastly, and most importantly, I wanted to add that AQB approval of a PAREA program should be sufficient to satisfy state regulators. States should not be taking their own individual look at PAREA programs and deciding whether one or more will be approved or not approved. Again, the uncertainty of not knowing if one or more states are going to approve a PAREA program and the cost of state approval could make it very difficult for a potential PAREA provider to make that all-important go, no-go decision. AQB approval of the content and the delivery should be sufficient. Furthermore, limiting the applicability of PAREA to anything less than 100% of the required experience hours defeats the intent and purpose of the program. The ability of trainees to find supervisors is exactly the problem that PAREA is intended to help solve. If an aspiring appraiser still has to go out and find a supervisor, even if it is only for a limited amount of time, be that a day, a week, or a month, it defeats the purpose of PAREA and again makes it very difficult for providers to make that decision. And some states have been considering the concept of overlays, meaning that appraisers can utilize PAREA to satisfy 100% of the experience hour requirements, but that they must also complete additional requirements above and beyond what is required of them in PREA. This too defeats the purpose of PREA. States are very strongly encouraged to accept AQB-approved PREA programs to satisfy 100% of the required experience hours for the LR and CR credentials without any additional layers of state approval or any additional state-specific overlays. And if states are going to accept PREA at something less than 100%, or if they're going to impose those additional overlay requirements, I think they need to have a very, very good data-supported justification for doing so. I think states could put themselves in a very precarious position with state legislators if they are simply replacing existing barriers to entry into the profession with unnecessary new barriers to entry into the profession that will still deprive folks of the right to work. This will be especially true because there is a national model allowing 100% credit. And of course, we've already seen some states that have allowed the full 100% credit. With that, I've come to the end of my presentation. We are going to have a few minutes for questions at the end. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. And I'm going to turn the podium over to a man that needs no introduction to this group, Mr. Peter Fontana. So thank you. And Peter, take it away.
Thank you very much, Scott. If you can bear with me here, I'll get the technical issues out of the way and share my screen. Did that work out for everybody? Thank you. So I appreciate the opportunity to present in front of my fellow regulators and fellow officials of Arrow as well. I want to thank the Appraisal Institute for including me on this panel for sure. My perspective of this particular issue of diversity and inclusion is a little bit is unique. As I chair the Montana board and struggle with all types of issues for making the inclusion of every professional that wants to get into this business available. I'm also the chair of the Veterans Outreach Subcommittee of the Appraisal Foundation. And we also, you heard President Bunton say on Monday that we also have a diversity and inclusion committee as well that are working on these topics. And these two particular committees work in concert with each other because they're very similar in our goal to bring in veterans into the appraisal profession, as well as folks of diversity and color and different genders into our profession. So I have a unique perspective of this particular topic, being a regulator and also sitting and chairing one of the foundation's panel that are dealing with this issue. So I'm excited to at least discuss some of the things that we've done in Montana to break down some of these barriers, tear down some of the barriers to entry, and make our profession more available to folks interested in becoming appraisers. So our regulatory structure has changed over the years. And so our regulatory boards have more appraisal products or valuation products to look at if a complaint's filed, and that would include evaluations, AVM, bifurcated appraisals, and even appraisal waivers. Our job as appraisal regulators is largely to protect the public interest. And to do that, we have to be able to vet complaints that are filed with us by consumers. And some of these complaints are going to be filed on evaluations, AVM, bifurcated appraisals, and appraisal waivers if the particular product gets in the way of these people being able to refinance their home or purchase a home. And it's going to be our job to review these. And so we need to ask, do we have the adequate tools to review these type of appraisal products? And part of the problem is that the pandemic has swung us to engage in more technology in the appraisal profession to get the assignments done. And our session just before this, the AMC session, highlighted that particular phenomena very well, and that is not going to go away now that the pandemic is easing, because there is this notion that technology can be used to obtain values in a credible manner. However, if the appraisal regulatory system doesn't address the fact that we are losing appraisers to retirement and are not and don't acknowledge that the appraisal supervisor model is basically broken and needs to be tweaked, then we're setting ourselves up for impending doom, because the values will be obtained by our the folks in the marketplace, with or without us. And so that's why I'm encouraging my fellow regulators to be open-minded in this initiative. So I think it's important to acknowledge, and we've talked about this at past Arrow sessions, but I think it's important to note that the Supreme Court decision on the North Carolina dental case is key to our regulation moving forward, because in that particular case, the federal antitrust law is central to the safeguard of the nation's free market structure. And so we don't want to be trying to heap unnecessary or barriers or overlays on top of the AQB criteria for licensure without having a statement of reasonable necessity. And Scott talked about this earlier. If you're going to have an overlay over the AQB's minimum requirements to become licensed, then I encourage your board to have a discussion about the statement of reasonable necessity. And that discussion would be to say, having this overlay in the past and moving forward has increased the first-time test taker scores on the AQB exam, or it has reduced the number of complaints that we've seen at our board because we have more qualified and more educated appraisers. But you'll have to back up these overlays with some type of statement of necessity, or you could be faced with a violation of the antitrust law based on this North Carolina dental case. So in Montana, our legislature passed an active supervision statute, and this is not just for the appraiser regulatory system, but for all professional licensing individuals under the state of Montana charter. And basically it requires that the state agency take an active role in professional licensing boards in advising of possible antitrust issues. And so if the state legal team or our administrator says that the topic we're discussing, or maybe it's an administrative rule we're passing that we're going to heap additional requirements on top of the AQB criteria, they may advise that that is an antitrust issue. And if we proceed forward with that, then it's to our own peril, and the board members are basically on their own if they get sued, because they were advised that it could have antitrust issues. And so that was a direct result of the North Carolina dental case, but it ties in perfectly with this topic, because we have to be careful that we're not keeping people out of this industry, especially people of color and diverse backgrounds, because they don't have the same opportunities to get into this industry, which is number one, trying to find a mentor. We already know that that's the biggest problem in our industry, is folks trying to find a mentor. So what is our job as regulators is to responsibly license individuals that meet the AQB criteria, and to examine those applicants to see if they have any felonies or misdemeanors that would be harmful to the public if they were admitted into this profession. And we're also here to field and hear complaints from consumers against appraisers or AMCs that we regulate. But what we're not here to do is to interfere with individuals desiring to enter the profession who meet the minimum criteria. And part of that minimum criteria is going to be the examination of each state's laws and rules to say, why do we have these overlays? And then try to develop those statements of necessary intent of why are they in place. And so be careful about what your job is as a state regulator, and it's certainly not to interfere with individuals trying to enter the profession. So the makeup of our profession, they talked about this at the session just before this. Catherine Owen of Bank of America spoke very eloquently about this is that the makeup of our profession is the majority white males that are over 55 years old. And so how do we overcome these issues of the aging population of appraisers and that we don't have any diversity in our appraisal profession, or limited diversity, I should say? Well, I would call on my fellow regulators to be bold in your approach to regulation and be very progressive. Tear down the barriers to unnecessary barriers to entry. Conduct those hearings that ask what the statement of necessity is for those particular overlays. Accept PAREA in whole. I can't stress this enough, and I'm not stressing this from being a trustee on the board of the Appraisal Foundation board. I'm stressing this as a chair of the Montana board to try to tear down the barriers to entry and accept PAREA in whole, so we can offer the opportunities for people of diverse background and young individuals to get into this profession and replace the aging population. My position on the foundation as the chair of the Veterans Outreach Committee, 35% of all retiring veterans are folks of minority, of color. And so part of my initiative on the Veterans Outreach is to make it easier for our veterans to become appraisers. And that is going to be incumbent on the states accepting PAREA in whole. Also, think about accepting alternative forms of experience. So we were pleased in Montana last year, we rewrote our administrative rules. We are accepting 100% of experience from other types of appraisal disciplines. For example, ad valorem tax appraisal experience. We're accepting review appraisal experience 100% if that's how you obtain your experience. Remember that there's three legs to the stool. You have all the education requirements that are geared towards standards 1 and 2, and then you have a rigorous national certification exam that's all geared towards standards 1 and 2. So you have two gatekeepers for individuals that are applying to be a real property appraiser. So if their experience comes from a different form that you're just not used to, don't be afraid of it, embrace it. And so we ask that you look at your rules to accept these alternative forms of experience so people have opportunities to get into this profession. And finally, we need to make our profession more representative of the social fabric of America. And state regulators have a unique opportunity because you can directly influence this by accepting PAREA, by accepting alternative forms of experience. And so you have this unique opportunity to do this by rule or local, and maybe your rules might not be sufficient. I guarantee you that it's far easier to change state statute and rule than it is to get federal legislation passed to make it universal requirement to do some of these things. And so I'm calling on my fellow state regulators to embrace this unique opportunity you have to make our profession more diverse and make it look more like the social fabric of America. And I'm happy to take questions at the end, but right now I want to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Craig Steinle.
All right, can you hear me, Sherry? All okay? Good. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so pleased to be back in front of Arrow friends and familiar faces. I have to say the last couple of days have been a bit melancholy in the sense that we should be together and doing some of the unique and celebratory things that we do as regulators when we gather. I probably never thought I'd utter the words that I'm about to say, but I certainly miss the Weston DC City Center and all that goes on there. And I hope that in October we can gather again and if nothing else, maybe do a little learning after dark. But I'm pleased to be invited. Thank you for having me. And I, of course, was chosen for the easy topic today, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. I want to spend some time talking about the Appraisal Institute's reaction, some efforts that we're making in this area. And I'm also interested in talking about kind of where things stand today, the state of the industry with regard to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm actually pleased about this topic. When I decided to step forward to be an officer of the Appraisal Institute. This was one of the hot button issues for me. It's something I wrote about when I put out my candidate questionnaire. I'm pleased that it's come so fast to the forefront for us to be talking about. And certainly the Appraisal Institute is leaning into this issue. Listen, appraisal is a human endeavor. And I've heard someone say that human beings bring to the appraisal process their brilliance, and they also bring their biases along with that, whether they realize that or not. And to that extent, as human beings, when we hear even one story in the media about an individual who feels that race somehow played a part of their valuation, that's one story too many for us. My background as an appraiser, I know, and those of you on the line, we're the objective source. We read the market. We don't make the market. When I hear terms like undervaluation, which is an active term, as though someone went in and purposely undervalued, it's hard to hear. And I hate to go all USPAP on you here, but those of you that know me would probably expect a little USPAPian talk. Just look at the definition of appraiser, excuse me, is someone who performs competently, but they're independent, impartial, and objective. And if you look up bias in the USPAP document, you know that bias is someone who's got a preference or an inclination that gets in the way of their independence or their impartiality or their objectivity. Appraisers and bias are at opposite ends of the spectrum. And so it's hard to reconcile these stories that come out that accuse appraisers of bias. And it's hard sometimes for those of us in the profession to hear them. We have policy makers and scholars who are suggesting that we might look to other ways that are still independent, impartial, and objective, but might expand the way in which we value properties. And of course, you all know that our approaches to value have been grounded in economic policy and sound principles for a long, long time. So we have to be careful when we start talking about changing the way appraisers look at this problem and act in their professional capacity because of some of the unintended consequences. If something is worth $1, it does absolutely no good to say it's worth $1.25, and it also doesn't do any good to say it's worth 75 cents. That puts a lot of people in harm's way if we're not the independent source of valuation that reads the market rather than tries to create it. Unconscious bias is part of the fabric of human beings. It's things that we do that we're not even aware of. And to that extent, I think all professionals out there are interested in understanding more about things that may be happening that they're not even aware of, that may inadvertently interject bias into their process. And I found most appraisers are willing to listen and to know more about that. It's hard to be accused of the opposite of implicit bias, or at least the other end of the spectrum, which is explicit bias, where you specifically go out and try to discriminate based on whatever it is in your background that makes you decide that that's the right thing to do. There's no place for that in our profession, and you all know that. And when we hear these stories, we have no idea about what the circumstances are behind the various stories that are going on. We don't have any idea about the way in which the appraisal was ordered. We don't have any idea about any appeals that were happened, any reconsideration of value. I want to echo what Dave Bunton said earlier in the week, that we just don't have a lot of data about these stories that are coming out. But we do know that appraisal is part of a larger ecosystem. There's a lot of professions that we're involved with. And it's been good to see the appraiser groups get together and collaborate. I'm a big believer in collaboration. We do much better when we all work together, all of the various appraisal groups, rather than silo ourselves, which at times in the past has happened. I want to talk about the Appraisal Institute's efforts, a very broad set of efforts that we've undertaken, as I said, to kind of lean into the diversity, equity, and inclusion circumstances, trying to advance the concept of equity of all type, racial, gender equity, personal characteristic equity. We definitely are wanting to be part of that solution. We've met with the Brookings Institute, Dr. Perry and his team several times. We've become part of the Brookings Institute Challenge that's looking at alternative ways of valuing property. And certainly we're working with Congress, with Chairman Maxine Waters and the House Financial Services Committee, trying to effect good solutions to whatever issues exist out there. At the Institute, we're redoubling our efforts in the area of ethics education and training. And we've put together, under development now, a 5-hour seminar where we discuss for our members and for other appraiser stakeholders across the country. We discuss implicit bias, unconscious bias, things we're not aware of. We talk about explicit bias, which is essentially discrimination. We also talk about structural bias, things that have caused the circumstances to be what they are today: restrictive covenants in the past, redlining, targeted, subprime mortgage opportunities that have been used. All of those things we have to acknowledge and make sure folks are aware through education and training. We've updated our code of professional ethics to make sure that we have broad protection for folks in protected classes and those that have personal characteristics that are different than ours. We've introduced a new guide note, and I'd ask everyone in the industry to take a look at the guide note. It talks about the use of personal characteristics in the value. On additional seminars, you've seen the Foundation and AI cooperate on seminars, and the other organizations as well. We're really trying to have a unified effort here in the profession. We can do quite a bit more when we're all together than, as I said earlier, when we stand apart and don't talk well to each other. We've asked the Appraisal Foundation, we're trying to help them to look more at standards and qualifications and how they can affect change and make appraisers aware of unconscious bias. Continuous education really is the key for us. We do have 2 project teams, which is the Appraisal Institute's way of talking about work groups. We've got one that's now reviewing the studies that are out there, looking at methodology and conclusions. We've got a team of our PhD members, our academia members, looking at those. We want to understand what's been done in those studies and the data that they're using, the conclusions that they've had. We also have a project team underway that's looking at alternative appraiser methodology. I don't know quite where that will lead. Certainly it's an open-ended question, but we want to be sensitive to the fact that there's a call to look at that, and we certainly want to be part of the solution at the table. Look, the big effort that is underway that has been talked about all this week is to recruit appraisers that are more diverse into this profession. We have a lot of diverse faces in the communities across America, and we want the appraiser population, the professionals, to look more like America. I can say personally, I want the Appraisal Institute to look more like America in terms of the demographics when we have appraisers out there doing this work that we all love. To that end, the Appraisal Institute has an appraiser diversity initiative, which in partnership with Fannie Mae and the National Urban League, we've been providing scholarships and mentoring and training, trying to get persons of color and women and actually anyone who has been disadvantaged in getting into the profession through that initiative. We've also got our Education and Relief Fund. That's got a corpus of over $7 million that has been donated by past Appraisal Institute professionals. And we have scholarships for minorities and women trying to bring them into the business. We've had those for a long time, and we put additional emphasis on them at this time. It's a time for us to become more culturally aware. Certainly consumer rights groups are out advocating on behalf of racial equity and other types of equity, and we want to be listening, we want to be learning, we want to be sensitive to those. And as a profession, I think we've done a great job of trying to come together to be responsive. In the area of explicit discrimination, explicit bias or discrimination that I've talked about earlier, there's no place for that in our profession. And we encourage folks who feel that they have experienced explicit bias to take that up with the various federal agencies and protections that consumers have. Another way to increase diversity is through the PREA program. You've heard several speakers talk about that. There's a PREA session after this one. I won't belabor the mechanics, but I want to make an announcement today on behalf of the Appraisal Institute. We submitted a design brief some weeks ago. That's basically a rough outline of what we intend to do. The qualifications board accepted our design brief. And so I think we're at step one of a longer process to try to look carefully at Perea to see if it is something that we can bring to the industry. There's still the question of financial feasibility. It's a very big investment. You got to make sure for the members of the Appraisal Institute, there's some ROI on that. But as a service to the profession, it would be a disservice, in fact, if the Appraisal Institute did not strongly consider this and try to figure out how the Appraisal Institute can bring this to market. We also agree that it gets rid of many of the unnecessary barriers. And if you think the barriers are tough for a middle-aged white man like me to get into the business, you know how much more difficult it is for a person of color or a woman or someone with personal characteristics that are different than ours to try to break into the profession. Perea is an excellent solution to help us become more diverse. We've also got a Women's Initiative Committee. We formed that in 2019, and those folks have been so active. I'd love to take minutes to tell you about all the things that they're doing. It's amazing to see a group that engaged and energized, putting together initiatives for the Appraisal Institute. And of course, we've had a diversity panel for a long, long time that's been very active, and even more so now because of the circumstances on the ground. So finally, where are things now in the industry and in the Appraisal Institute? Associations and companies all across the country are dealing with the issue of implicit bias, and generally the idea that we want to be more diverse, we want to be more equitable, and as an association, as a profession, we want to be more inclusive. We want people to look at us and say, that's a very inclusive group of people. I can see myself there. We also know that there's going to be ongoing scrutiny. There'll be more articles, I am fearful, that show up in the paper or the magazines or on the blogs because they kind of draw readers in, and we want to ask ourselves the questions behind those. The real estate challenges in our industry, we definitely have to acknowledge those, and it's hundreds of years of history. This situation will not be solved overnight by a committee or a panel. This is going to take a concerted effort from all of us. We know that across America, only 44% of Black households own their home. On the other end of the spectrum, 75% of white households own their own home. Those barriers that we've talked about to diversity, equity, and inclusion are a long time in our history. They were a long time being built. And it's going to take long-term solutions to get there, to get to those. And that's what I'm talking about at the bottom, new solutions. But this is such a large topic, such a large embedded systemic topic that we also need to recognize that it's going to involve legislators, it's going to involve regulators. It's certainly going to involve policy changes and federal and state funding. This is not something that appraisers as a group can change overnight, nor should they. I want to say this is a great opportunity for us to educate the public on what we do and how we do that. It goes right to the theme of a lot of us in terms of public trust. And as the more that we can talk about this, the more we can lean into it and collaborate and get into rooms and solve problems, I think the better off we are for educating the public. I want to close on this thought. The profession right now, as seen by younger people, and I'm speaking specifically about the type of demographic that we want to recruit into the industry. Young professionals are much more sensitive. They've been much more aware in their life of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Gen Y and Gen Z folks, they grew up with this. They're a very inclusive group as a whole, very diverse, and they are judging our profession. And frankly, they are judging the Appraisal Institute by the seasoned long-term appraisers like many on this meeting and myself. Our actions really are being judged by those young people when they ask themselves, is this a profession for me? Is this an association for me? Is this someplace that I feel included? And there are consumer advocates that are also paying attention to that. Our actions matter in the profession. What we do as a collaborative group, what we do independently to try to help with diversity, equity, inclusion in our associations and the businesses across America. I believe it's a defining moment in the history of diversity, racial equity, gender equity, et cetera, and inclusion. Defining moment in history. And I think we all want to be part of that defining moment and not ignore it. This is a problem that needs our attention. It needs our collaborative solutions. It's not something that we can ignore thinking it will go away. And I'm pleased that it was given such mainline emphasis here at the Arrow Conference. With that, I think we've got time for questions. And again, thank you for the opportunity to speak. Let me stop sharing and pass this back to Sherry.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Peter. Let's see, I do have some questions in the chat box. I think that Kevin's question regarding valuation bias was answered by someone else. Am I correct on that, Kevin?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thanks. And then Scott posted, yeah, the valuation bias for Kevin. Thank you, Scott. Let's see, we have this from, I believe it's still Kevin. Are there recommended resources for identifying and dealing with implicit bias? Has that been answered yet? I don't.
William Waltenbaugh. I think I got that right. He did send me a resource. I think it's in the chat as well. Look, it was sent to everybody.
Oh, okay, okay. Well, that seems to cover all of the chat comments or questions. Now I'm going to look at if there are any hands up in the participants box. I don't see any, but Peter, go ahead.
There was a question in the chat, but I see that it was a direct message, but I do want to address it. The question was, is the foundation working on behalf of all veterans, regardless of race or gender? I'd be happy to visit with you offline on that. And the answer to that is absolutely. In fact, we've set up a veterans resource page on the foundation website, and we've identified veteran mentors on the page that prospective veterans, regardless of race or color or creed, can call these mentors and ask them questions about the profession. There's probably 12 or 14 people on there from all disciplines of the military that are all appraisers. And so our initiative is to help all veterans. I just pointed out in the presentation that 35% of the retiring veterans are folks of color. And our Veterans Outreach Task Force is extremely diverse. We have somebody from the, and I mean in disciplines and people that can help us with this. We have the chief appraiser from the VA. We have the Appraisal Institute. We have representatives from Bank of America, Wells Fargo, CoreLogic. And so we have expanded our network to include all these folks to help all veterans. I just pointed out that a good portion of the retiring veterans are folks of color or female. So I just want to point that out to our questionnaire.
Thank you, Peter. I do have a hand raised. It's David Retzel. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure, Sherry, thank you.
Thanks.
David Reitzel, North Carolina Chair of the Appraisal Board. Great presentation, Craig, Peter, and Scott. Great points. So my question would be, is this a presentation that we could use at our board meetings? Would you guys be comfortable from the Institute allowing us to use this? This was a great presentation.
Sure. From my perspective, I certainly don't have any problem with that. And I was also going to offer a comment, but it goes along with the same kind of request. But, if you all as state regulators need some help in putting together language to institute the continuing education requirements or to clarify the board's disciplinary authority and where complaints related to appraiser bias and discrimination really should be directed, please feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to help you in putting that language together. Quite frankly, it's fairly simple. We've worked with folks in Minnesota. We've been working very closely on the bill in California. And we can share some of those resources and experiences with you all as regulators in other states. So David, I'll get your email address from Don or someone, and I'll make sure that I forward you a copy of my presentation.
Let me piggyback if I could, David. I believe, and I'll ask Brandy and Joe, I think the presentations in the past have been submitted and made part of the Arrow website. Is that your intention here again? Okay, that's a head nod. I'll take that as
yes, it is.
So to your question and to everyone else, happy to provide the slide deck, and anytime you want Scott to come talk, I just call him up. He's always happy to go anywhere, particularly places that are, hard to get to, 3 flights to get there in a rental car for 4 hours. We love to those locations. So anyway.
I think the Virgin Islands really needs to consider this issue very closely, very soon.
And David, I always offer to every one of my fellow state regulators, especially with the advent of the Zoom platform, if you need assistance or you want any advice or technical expertise of what we have done or what we're working on the national level, I'd be happy to present in front of your board or show up on a Zoom meeting. And I make that proposal to all of my regulators on this call today.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to, I don't have any hands up, but I would like to read a couple of comments. This is from
Joe's trying to get in, Sherry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I got a quick comment. First of all, Craig, Peter, Scott, great job. I was a little apprehensive away. Thank you. Craig, I got a question for you. When do you perceive the AI having this 5-hour class up and running?
Boy, Joe, when you mentioned my name, I couldn't imagine just exactly what kind of question you had stored away and planted for me to answer, but that's an easy one. Our 5-hour course should be available this summer. I think we're going to debut it. We'll try to do that with lots of fanfare, and I would encourage everyone to take it. I've seen some of the original scripts that have gone on, and it really looks to be quite interesting.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
And Sherry, I just wanted to add that somebody in the chat box was looking for like an outline for a program, and I would just say, stay tuned. Like Craig said, our valuation bias program is coming out in the summer, and that would probably, I would think, be a good outline.
Absolutely. Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, I have a question, one more question. Thank you for that answer, by the way. Is there a program that you guys have already put together, like a roadshow of some sort that could go into high schools maybe to sort of plant the seed of appraising as a career path? Is my mic on? Okay.
Yes.
I saw Peter's box light up. I thought my friend Pete was going to take that one from
the question is, are we reaching out to high school students about the profession or about this particular topic? Look,
about the profession. So, I mean, if part of the goal is to bring in more minority people, it's never really too early to start sort of planting the seed. Hey, this is a way you might want to consider going. And so my question is there anything that could be brought to the high schools and show high school students when they're thinking about college, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, that's a great question. And I can tell you what we're doing at the foundation is that through our degree approval program, where we're approving colleges and universities to, when you graduate, you have either all or a substantial amount of your education requirements fulfilled to become an appraiser. We are now, through our diversity and inclusion subcommittee and the Veterans Committee, working with military and predominantly Black colleges to try to get them to go through our degree approval program so these folks can be looking at the real estate business as a career. I'm not sure that we've thought about that down to the high school level. But I certainly will take that under advisement and discuss it with our chair of the diversity and inclusion, because I don't think you can, when people are making decisions about what they want to do in the future, that's when they're doing it. So that's a very good point, and I appreciate the comment.
Thank you.
Chair, if we have just one more second, there was a question from Brandy that I'd like to respond to, if that's okay. And
Yeah, I was
Brandy-
trying to get that. Mhm. Go ahead.
Brandy, the answer to your question is absolutely yes. And Craig, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, but we have a team put together that is going through all of the appraisals and all of the research studies that have been, that we have seen on this topic. I guess the only commentary that I would add to that is that no amount of counter data and counterintelligence and argument is going to be sufficient to satisfy those that have been affected by an appraiser who has engaged in bias or discrimination. And these are issues, and I like to say they're issues whether they're issues or not. And we just have to deal with them, on a case-by-case basis. But this is something that, we can put all of the data and research in place to show that, the appraisals perhaps were accurate. Perhaps in some cases they were overvaluing properties. But to the people that are affected by this, that's not going to be sufficient.
Thank you, Scott. Do you see anything else in there, Scott, that I didn't get to? Blair had just a comment that this year at the Appraisal Summit, they are putting on several events specifically for trainees, and she would advise anyone that is interested to attend, and the NAA will be putting on these events. So just for everyone to know. Are there any other questions that maybe I've missed? I think we're kind of down to our time to be done. So I want to again recognize our gracious sponsors, Platinum Reba, gold sponsors, American Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers, Appraisal Institute, Clear Capital, National Association of Realtors, Service One, Service Link, and Solidify. And I want to especially thank these panelists for a very quality presentation. I learned a lot, and I'm thinking a lot now about these issues. So thank you so very much. Everybody give them a great virtual hand.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you kindly.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.